Liam Carter was born into a world where luxury masked the absence of love. The Carter mansion stood like a palace. Marble floors gleamed under golden chandeliers, and extravagant parties filled its halls with laughter and clinking glasses. But for Liam, the house was never a home. It was a stage where his parents played their roles for high society while their real selves waged silent wars behind closed doors. His father, Alexander Carter, was a man who commanded empires with the flick of his hand and crushed opposition with a single look. But his power didn't end in the boardroom. It extended to his home, to his wife, Eleanor, whose once vibrant laughter had long since faded into quiet compliance. Liam's earliest memories were of arguments that never turned into shouting, because shouting wasn't necessary when silence held more power. He remembered watching from behind the grand staircase, knees hugged to his chest, as his mother's voice trembled under the weight of his father's quiet fury. "Did you really think you could leave me, Eleanor?" That night, he had seen something he could never unsee. His mother, strong and graceful, reduced to a woman kneeling on the cold marble floor, her hands clenched into fists as tears dripped onto the ground. She never tried to leave again. From that moment, Liam learned two things. Love was not freedom. Love was a cage. And in his father's world, no one escaped. A boy who refused to be his father. As he grew older, Liam watched himself become everything he once feared: ruthless, distant, untouchable. He was born with the Carter blood, after all. He inherited his father's sharp instincts, his calculating mind, and, most of all, his inability to love without control. But unlike Alexander Carter, Liam made himself a promise. He would never love someone enough to need them. He would never let anyone get close enough to hurt him. And he would never, never become a father. Instead, he built walls. And on the foundation of those walls, he built an empire. By 30, Liam Carter had turned Carter Global into a financial powerhouse. He orchestrated billion-dollar deals with precision, turned boardrooms into battlegrounds, and crushed his competitors without hesitation. To the world, he was the perfect CEO. To his rivals, he was a nightmare. To women, he was an enigma, a man whose touch was intoxicating but whose heart was untouchable. Love was just another form of control, and Liam had spent his entire life making sure no one could ever hold power over him. Or so he thought, because fate had other plans. And soon, one woman would walk into his life, the only one who wouldn't fall at his feet, the only one who wouldn't be afraid of him, a woman who would make him question everything. But first, she would break him. The Cartier Grand Hotel gleamed under the golden glow of chandeliers, its towering glass walls reflecting the city lights. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey, expensive perfumes, and quiet power plays disguised as casual conversation. It was the kind of place where billionaires shook hands over multi-million-dollar deals, where the wealthy whispered behind crystal glasses, and where reputations were polished like diamonds. And tonight, at the center of it all, stood Liam Carter. Dressed in a sharp black suit, his posture was effortless, his expression unreadable. He stood by the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the crowd with the cold detachment of a man who had long since learned that people were nothing more than pawns in a game. He wasn't here for pleasure. He never was. Hosting a charity gala had nothing to do with goodwill. It was strategy. A move designed to solidify his company's influence among the city's elite. And as far as Liam was concerned, tonight was just another transaction. Until she walked in. Elena Foster had planned hundreds of high-profile events in her career. She had orchestrated weddings for royalty, corporate galas for the country's wealthiest families, and political fundraisers where secrets were exchanged more than pleasantries. She had met powerful men before. She knew their type. They all carried themselves the same way, detached, arrogant, untouchable. And Liam Carter? He was no different. Or at least, that's what she thought. She had seen him from a distance before, in newspapers, on financial news broadcasts, in the whispers of New York's most powerful circles. But meeting him in person? That was something else entirely. Elena had been moving through the ballroom, checking last-minute details, when she noticed him. Even in a sea of powerful men, he stood out. Not because of his wealth, not even because of his striking looks, but because he carried something that most men in this room didn't, an aura of absolute control. He didn't engage in empty conversations. He didn't indulge in fake laughter. He simply watched, like a king surveying his kingdom. And yet, despite his carefully maintained distance, something about him felt restless, as if he was searching for something, or perhaps as if he was waiting. Elena didn't hesitate. She approached, standing beside him at the bar, her voice effortlessly smooth. "Mr. Carter, I hope tonight's event meets your expectations." Liam turned his head slightly, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. A slow, deliberate once-over. Not in the way men looked at women they wanted, but in the way predators assessed a potential threat. "I have no complaints," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "Not a thank you. Not a compliment. Just a cold, indifferent statement. Most people, especially women, would have flustered under his gaze. But Elena Foster was not most people." She smiled, tilting her head slightly. "That's good. It would be a shame if I had to issue a refund." For the first time that night, Liam blinked. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But she had caught him off guard. And that? That was rare. Elena didn't linger. She had done her job, checked in, and was already turning away, as if talking to the infamous Liam Carter had been nothing more than another task on her list. Liam watched her go, something unfamiliar flickering in his chest. He wasn't used to that. Women didn't just walk away from him. They lingered. They tried to impress him. They sought his attention. But Elena Foster had walked away first. And maybe that was why, hours later, when the event was winding down and the guests were slowly trickling out, he didn't leave. Maybe that was why, for the first time in years, Liam Carter stayed. It was past midnight when he found her again. She was standing near the terrace, a glass of wine in her hand, watching the city skyline. Alone. Not networking, not mingling, just existing. Liam approached, his footsteps measured. "You're not much of a people person, are you?" Elena turned slightly, her lips curving. "Funny. I was going to say the same about you." A slow silence stretched between them, the hum of the city below filling the space. Then, in an almost amused tone, Liam murmured, "You don't seem afraid of me." Most people were. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Should I be?" Liam smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Depends on how close you plan on getting." She laughed softly, shaking her head. And damn it, he liked the sound of it. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. But in that quiet moment, as the night stretched on and the world around them faded, Liam leaned in, and Elena didn't pull away. Her breath hitched, her lips soft against his, the taste of wine still lingering on her tongue. It was brief, barely a second, but in that single moment, everything changed. Liam Carter, a man who had spent his life untouched, unmoved, uninvolved, had just made his first mistake. And for the first time, he didn't care. Liam Carter had never believed in forever. He had seen how love could turn into control, suffocation, a slow death of the soul. His father had called it love. His mother had called it a prison. And Liam? He had spent his entire life making sure he would never step inside that cage. That was why what he had with Elena Foster was perfect. No labels, no expectations, no messy emotions. She was there when he wanted her, gone when he needed space, simple, clean, no complications. At least, that's what he told himself. At first, it was just casual, a few nights a week, nothing permanent, nothing serious. But then he started noticing things. A coffee mug that wasn't his sitting on his kitchen counter. A bottle of her perfume left in his bathroom. A sweater draped over his chair, carrying the faintest trace of her scent. Little things. Things that made her presence linger long after she was gone. And somehow, Liam let them stay. He told himself it was nothing, that she was nothing more than another passing moment in his life. But the truth was, Elena Foster had already woven herself into him, and he was letting it happen. Most women wanted something from him, his name, his power, his promises. But Elena never did. She never pushed, never demanded, never asked the one question he had always dreaded. What are we? She acted as if she didn't need an answer, and maybe that was what kept him coming back. Because with her, Liam didn't feel trapped. He didn't feel obligated. He didn't feel like he was losing control. With Elena, he could just be. And yet, even as she lay beside him at night, her body warm against his, Liam knew. One day, she would leave. Because Elena Foster wanted things Liam Carter would never give. And when the time came, she wouldn't beg him to change. She would simply walk away. It was a quiet evening. They were curled up on his couch, a movie playing in the background, neither of them really watching. Liam had one arm draped lazily over her shoulders, his other hand holding a glass of whiskey. It was comfortable. Then, she asked the question, "Have you ever thought about having kids?" Liam's body tensed. A simple question, an innocent one, but to him it felt like a loaded gun aimed straight at his chest. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he muttered, "No." His voice was flat, cold, final. Elena turned slightly to face him, her brown eyes searching his face. "You don't like children?" she asked softly. Liam exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "That's not it?" A pause. Then, "I just have no intention of ever having kids. Ever." The room felt suddenly smaller. The space between them, once so easy, so natural, now felt different. Elena didn't speak right away. She just stared at him for a moment, as if memorizing him. And then, she did something that terrified him. She smiled, a small, understanding smile, like she had just figured something out, like she had just accepted something he wasn't ready to face. Elena never brought it up again. She didn't try to change his mind. She didn't argue. But Liam noticed things after that night. The way she touched him lingered just a little longer. The way she looked at him held something softer, sadder. The way she curled up against him at night, as if memorizing the feel of him. She wasn't saying it, but Liam knew. She was preparing herself to leave, and maybe she should have. Maybe it would have been better if she had walked away first. Because one night, fate made the choice for her. It started with something small, a missed period, a moment of dizziness, a feeling in the pit of her stomach she couldn't ignore. And then, there it was, 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. Elena stared at it, her breath caught in her throat, her hands trembled, her heart pounded. She should have been scared, but all she felt was a strange, quiet kind of peace, because for the first time, she knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted this baby. She wanted a family, and she knew. Liam Carter never would. For days, Elena struggled with what to do. She told herself she should tell him, that he deserved to know. But then, she thought about what he had said. "I just have no intention of ever having kids. Ever." She thought about his father. The way Liam flinched at the mention of love. The way he built walls so high no one had ever climbed them. And she realized, if she told him, he would stay. But not because he wanted to. Not because he loved her. Not because he wanted this child. He would stay because he felt obligated. And Elena refused to let her child grow up like that. So she made her choice. She packed her bags. She quit her job. She booked a one-way ticket out of town. And on the night before she left, she sat beside Liam in bed, watching him as he slept. She traced the sharp angles of his face with her fingertips, memorizing him one last time. And then, in the quiet darkness, she whispered the words she would never say to his face. "I love you, Liam. But I love this baby more." Liam woke up the next morning to silence. At first he thought she was in the kitchen. Then he checked the living room, the bathroom. But she was gone. And for the first time in his life, Liam Carter felt something he had never felt before. Loss. Not because someone had left, but because this time he had let them go. The bathroom light flickered weakly, casting a dull glow over the cold tile floor. The air was still, heavy with anticipation, thick with something unspoken. Elena Foster stood motionless, gripping the small plastic test in her trembling hands. 2 pink lines. She inhaled sharply, but the breath caught in her throat. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her. Wide eyes, parted lips, face pale as if the very blood had drained from her veins. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. And yet, the evidence was there, undeniable, sitting in her shaking grasp like a loaded gun, ready to change everything. The world outside her tiny apartment continued as if nothing had happened. Car horns blaring in the distance, the muffled chatter of pedestrians on the street below, the distant hum of life moving forward. But for Elena, time had stopped. She placed a hesitant hand over her stomach, fingers barely brushing against the fabric of her nightshirt. There was a life inside her. Liam's child. Their child. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She sat curled on the couch, legs pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around herself as if she could physically hold in the emotions threatening to spill over. The dim glow of a forgotten bedside lamp flickered in the corner, its warm light failing to chase away the cold creeping into her bones. Elena did not cry. Not yet. Not when the weight of reality sat heavy on her chest. Her thoughts swirled, racing, colliding, forming a storm inside her mind. She could already hear his voice, low, detached, absolute. "I just have no intention of having kids, ever." The memory of that moment played over and over like a cruel loop, each repetition striking deeper, cutting sharper. It hadn't been a careless remark. It had been a conviction. And now she was carrying his child, a part of him, a part of herself. A choice lay before her, stark and irreversible. Would she tell him? Would she risk seeing his expression turn cold, distant, unreadable? Would she watch him shut down before her very eyes, retreating behind those impenetrable walls he had built so carefully? Would she hear him say the words she feared most? "What do you expect me to do about it?" Her heart clenched. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't. Liam Carter was not a man who could be forced into a life he didn't want. And Elena refused to let her child grow up feeling like they were nothing more than a mistake. So, she made the hardest decision of her life. She chose to leave. Dawn crept through the city, painting the sky in hues of muted gold and pale lavender. Elena stood at the window of her apartment, staring out at the streets of Paris, memorizing them. Every building, every cafe, every street light. The city had once felt like a dream. Hers. Now, it felt like a place she no longer belonged. Her suitcase sat by the door, neatly packed, yet feeling heavier than anything she had ever carried. One last time, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over Liam's name in her contacts, hesitating. Her thumb trembled over the call button. She swallowed. And then, she pressed delete. Not just the number, everything. The messages, the photos, the voicemails she had kept, pretending she never cared enough to replay them late at night. Gone. She set the phone down, a quiet exhale escaping her lips. Then, without another glance behind her, Elena Foster walked out of the apartment, and out of Liam Carter's life. Paris had once been a city of dreams. Now it felt like a city of ghosts. The cafes she had loved, where she used to sit for hours, sipping espresso, sketching plans, watching life pass by, felt distant, foreign. The laughter of people on the sidewalks, the warm scent of fresh bread wafting from boulangeries, the twinkling lights reflecting on the Seine, all of it blurred together, meaningless. She walked the streets, saying goodbye in silence. To the bookstore on Rue Saint-Honoré, where she had spent rainy afternoons. To the tiny Italian restaurant tucked in a side alley, where she and Liam had once shared a bottle of wine. To the bridge where she had once stood, watching the city lights flicker, unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. Paris had been a home. But home was no longer an option. She needed a place where no one knew her name, a place where Liam would never find her. And so, with nothing but a suitcase, a plane ticket, and a secret growing inside her, Elena Foster vanished. The air smelled different here, not of sharp espresso and city fumes, but of fresh bread, ripe olives, and the warm, earthy scent of vineyards stretching beyond the horizon. The town was small, quiet, hidden in the rolling hills of the Italian countryside. Here, there were no skyscrapers, no billionaires, no ruthless businessmen with cold, unfeeling eyes, no Liam Carter. Just a fresh start. Elena moved into a small apartment on the second floor of a rustic building, its windows opening to a view of endless green fields kissed by golden sunlight. It wasn't the life she had once imagined, but it was a life she could give her child. And that was enough. Months passed. Her belly grew rounder, full, a quiet promise of the life that was about to enter the world. Elena spent evenings sitting on her balcony, watching the sunset spill across the horizon, bathing the hills in hues of fire and honey. Then, one evening, as the sky darkened to violet and the first stars blinked into existence, she felt it. A tiny flutter, soft, gentle, almost hesitant, she froze, and then, a second time, a tiny, undeniable kick, a sob caught in her throat, her breath shattering. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her stomach, feeling the delicate movement beneath her fingertips. Her child. Liam's child. She had been strong for so long, she had left behind everything. But in that moment, with the first proof of her baby's presence, the loneliness crashed down on her. She should have been sharing this with someone. She should have been whispering, "Liam, the baby just kicked." But Liam wasn't here. And he never would be. Because this was the life she had chosen, for her child, for herself, for the future she had built. Without him. And yet, deep in the quiet corners of her heart, a single question remained. Would he have stayed if he had known? She would never know, because some choices can never be undone. Liam Carter was a man who had everything: power, wealth, influence. To the world he was untouchable, a man who played the game of business like a grandmaster, always 3 steps ahead. But what no one saw, what he never allowed himself to acknowledge, was the emptiness. It had started small, the way his penthouse felt too big at night, the way silence settled into the corners of his life, stretching wider, deeper, until it felt suffocating. The way no amount of work, no billion-dollar deal, could quite fill the void. At first he told himself it was just exhaustion. Then he convinced himself it was nothing, just the side effect of winning. But as time passed, the feeling remained. A quiet ache. A whisper in the back of his mind, an absence he couldn't explain. And yet he never once thought of her, or at least, that's what he told himself. Florence, Italy, a city of history, of beauty, of memories waiting to shatter his world. Liam had come for business. Just another deal. Another empire to expand. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and warm bread as he stepped out of his car, the cobblestone streets slick with recent rain. It was supposed to be a simple lunch meeting, but fate had other plans. Because as he passed by the cafe, his gaze sweeping over the outdoor tables without much thought, he saw her, and the world stopped. Elena Foster, sitting at a sunlit table, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She hadn't changed. Her hair was longer, cascading over her shoulders. Her face was softer, more at peace. But her eyes, the ones he had memorized years ago, were still the same. Still held that fire, that quiet defiance. For a split second, Liam forgot how to breathe, forgot where he was, forgot everything. Because the woman he had lost, the woman who had disappeared from his life without a word, was right there. And then he saw the child, a small boy, no older than 4, sitting beside her, laughing, talking, completely unaware that he was about to destroy a man's world. Liam didn't move, didn't blink. He couldn't, because the child looked exactly like him. Jet black hair curling at the edges, sharp, piercing blue eyes, his eyes, the same small crease between his brows when he focused, just like Liam when he was a child. The cafe disappeared. The street noise blurred. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a war drum. He felt like he had been sucker punched, like the ground beneath him had been ripped away, sending him plummeting into something he couldn't control. Then, before he could move, before he could force his legs to take a single step, a shadow passed through his vision. Another man. Tall, well-dressed, confident. And he walked straight to their table. Liam's stomach plummeted. The man leaned down slightly, his voice warm, familiar. "Sorry I'm late. Have you been waiting long?" Elena looked up and smiled. And then, the moment that shattered everything. The little boy, his son, turned to the man and beamed. "Daddy!" Liam's entire world crashed. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe, because his son, the child he had never known existed, was calling another man Dad. His vision blurred. His pulse thundered in his ears. The air felt thick, suffocating, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening with something he couldn't even name. Pain? Rage? Desperation? It didn't matter, because he had already lost. 4 years. 4 years of his son's life. The first steps, the first words. The sleepless nights, the laughter, the scraped knees and whispered bedtime stories. All of it. Gone. Stolen. Liam took an unsteady step back. He wasn't sure how long he stood there. Seconds? Minutes? A lifetime? But by the time he forced himself to move, Elena had already stood, gathering her things, her hand resting gently on the boy's small shoulder. She turned her head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. And in that moment, he saw it. A flicker of recognition, a flash of something unreadable in her gaze, a hint of regret, and then she looked away. Just like that, she turned and walked away, taking the boy with her, taking his son, taking everything. Liam remained standing there, staring at the empty space where they had just been. The truth had been buried for years. But now? Now it had been unearthed, and Liam Carter was never a man who walked away from what was his. The night was restless. Liam Carter sat in the dimly lit confines of his hotel suite in Florence, a glass of whiskey untouched on the marble table beside him. Outside, rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a violent symphony that mirrored the turmoil inside him. On the table in front of him, a single envelope lay unopened. But he already knew what was inside. He had known the moment he saw that child in the cafe. Knew it in the way the boy's jet-black hair curled at the ends. Knew it in the way his sharp blue eyes mirrored Liam's own reflection. Knew it in the way his small, stubborn mouth twisted into a frown when he concentrated, just like Liam had done as a child. Still, he had needed confirmation. And now it sat before him, the results of the DNA test, a single piece of paper that had the power to rewrite his entire existence. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair before finally, breaking the seal and pulling out the contents. His gaze flicked down. 0.9% paternal match. The paper crumpled in his grip. He closed his eyes, jaw tightening, his breath slow and controlled. Noah was his son, and he had missed 4 years of his life. 4. Damn. Years. The glass of whiskey shattered against the wall, amber liquid dripping onto the carpet, but Liam barely noticed. The only thing that mattered now was Elena. It took less than an hour to find her. A small villa on the outskirts of town, nestled between vineyards and winding roads. By the time Liam's car pulled up in front of the house, the storm had settled into a light drizzle, but the tension inside him was relentless. His pulse pounded as he climbed out, his breath fogging in the crisp evening air. And then, she appeared. Elena Foster stood in the doorway, illuminated by the soft glow of porch lights. She had changed. Her hair was longer, cascading in soft waves over her shoulders. There were faint traces of exhaustion around her eyes, but she was still breathtaking. The same woman who had once undone him with a single glance. But tonight, there was no warmth in her gaze, no surprise, no panic, only quiet resignation, like she had been expecting him. Liam didn't waste a second. He climbed the steps in 2 strides, stopping inches away from her, his towering frame casting her in shadow. His voice was low, lethal. "How long were you going to keep him from me?" Elena didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even blink. She simply sighed, folding her arms across her chest. "I was protecting him," she said softly. Liam let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Protecting him?" His eyes darkened. "From what? Me?" She didn't answer. And that silence was worse than 1,000 words. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his body coiled tight with restrained fury. "I had a right to know." His voice was lower now, a quiet, restrained growl. "You stole 4 years from me, Elena." Her lips parted for a moment, as if she might say something, might fight back. But then, she closed her mouth and exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "You never wanted children." The words were a blade to the chest. Liam stiffened. She stepped forward then, her eyes searching his, but she wasn't pleading. She wasn't apologizing. She was simply stating a fact. "I did what was best for Noah," she said, voice steady. "I gave him a life free from a father who never wanted him." Liam's breath hitched. For the first time, his composure cracked, his mask slipping as something raw, something dangerously close to heartbreak, flashed in his eyes. "Elena." She shook her head. "I remember every word you ever said, Liam. You didn't just say you weren't ready." Her voice trembled, but she held firm. You said you would never have kids, that you couldn't be a father, that love was nothing but a cage. Liam's pulse thundered in his ears. She wasn't wrong. He had spent his entire life running from attachments, from the idea of family, from the very thing that had destroyed his mother. He had sworn he would never let history repeat itself. And yet history had found a way to repeat anyway. Except this time, he had been the one left behind. He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. I was wrong. Elena blinked. I was wrong, he repeated, this time with more force. And because of that, I lost 4 years. 4 years of my son's life. She looked away. Liam stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his voice a quiet plea beneath the anger. Let me fix this. Her breath shook. But before she could answer, a small voice broke through the night air. Mom? Liam froze. Elena's entire body went rigid. Slowly, so slowly, she turned toward the source of the voice. And there, standing in the soft glow of the porch light, was Noah. Their son. The little boy rubbed his sleepy eyes, his tiny frame barely covered by an oversized t-shirt. His dark curls were messy from sleep. His blue eyes, Liam's blue eyes, stared up at them both in confusion. And then, in a voice that was far too soft to belong to the hurricane of emotions raging inside Liam, Noah blinked and asked, Who is he, Mom? The world stopped. Elena stiffened. Liam's heart cracked wide open. His throat was dry. His limbs felt heavy. But despite all of that, despite everything, Liam Carter took a slow, unsteady breath. And for the first time in his life, he looked into his son's eyes. The late afternoon sun cast golden streaks through the trees, bathing the quiet town in soft, flickering light. Liam Carter stood in front of a modest house, his heartbeat too slow, too loud. The weight of this moment settled deep in his bones. He had stood in boardrooms across the world, signed billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, crushed competitors with a single glance. But this was the first time in his life that he was afraid. His knuckles hovered over the wooden door, hesitant. For 4 years, he had lived in ignorance. For 4 years, he had walked through life without knowing that his son was somewhere out there, calling another man Dad. Now he was about to meet him. A deep breath. Then he knocked. The door opened too quickly. And there she was. Elena, the same woman who had once unraveled him with a single glance, but tonight she wasn't looking at him with warmth. She wasn't looking at him at all. Her expression was guarded, as if she were bracing for a storm that was long overdue. Behind her, a small figure peeked from the hallway. Liam's throat tightened. Because there he was, his son. Noah. 4 years old, small for his age, with dark curls and piercing blue eyes that belonged to Liam. The little boy tilted his head, his gaze flickering between Elena and Liam. Elena hesitated for only a second, then sighed and stepped aside. Come in. Liam entered cautiously, feeling like an outsider in his own life. The house smelled of vanilla and something faintly sweet, like freshly baked cookies. Noah sat cross-legged on the floor, a collection of tiny superhero figurines spread out before him. His small fingers traced over the plastic capes, his brows knitted together in deep concentration. Liam didn't speak, didn't move too fast. He knew better than to scare the boy. Instead, he lowered himself to one knee, careful, measured, like approaching a wild animal that might bolt at the slightest wrong move. Noah's blue eyes flicked up at him. Curious, cautious, unsure. Liam swallowed hard. This was his son. And yet, he was nothing more than a stranger. Minutes stretched in silence, thick with the weight of the unknown. Then, Noah picked up a small action figure and turned it over in his hands. A tiny plastic Spider-Man. Do you like superheroes? The question was soft, hesitant. Liam blinked. He had closed multi-million-dollar deals in less time than it took him to respond. But somehow, this was the most important question he had ever answered. He leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low. I think Spider-Man is pretty cool. Noah's lips pressed together, considering his answer like it was a life-altering decision. Then, slowly, he shook his head. No way. Iron Man is cooler. Liam raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? Why's that? Noah sat up a little straighter. Because he has super suits, and he's really, really smart. A tiny smile tugged at the corner of Liam's mouth. Smart guys win, huh? Noah nodded seriously. And just like that, the walls between them began to crack. Elena watched from the kitchen, her arms crossed, a wary expression on her face. She had expected Liam to demand answers, to push too hard, to ruin this moment before it even began. But instead, he sat there, cross-legged on the floor, listening to Noah as if every word mattered. He didn't try to force a connection, didn't try to make Noah accept him. He just stayed. And Noah, slowly, cautiously, started letting him in. After a while, Noah leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Do you want to see my secret base? Liam met his gaze seriously. Secret base? Noah nodded. In my room. But only superheroes can come in. Liam hesitated, just for a moment, then leaned in. I think I can handle it. Noah studied him for a second, then grinned. A real, genuine, toothy grin. And in that moment, Liam felt something inside him shift. For the first time in his life, he understood something he had never dared to believe in. This wasn't about winning, wasn't about control. It was about something far more terrifying. It was about being a father, and he was willing to do whatever it took to be one. Liam Carter had always known how to win, in business, in negotiations, in life. But love? Love was a battlefield he had never dared to step onto. Yet here he was, learning, not from books, not from mentors, from a 4-year-old boy who thought Spider-Man could save the world, from a woman who had once loved him and had every reason not to trust him again. He wasn't here to convince them. He was here to earn his place. The scent of fresh coffee and warm pancakes filled the kitchen, sunlight spilling through the open windows. Liam stood by the stove, wearing an apron he never imagined himself owning. A spatula in one hand, a recipe pulled up on his phone in the other, and a very skeptical 4-year-old sitting on the counter, watching him like a judge on a cooking show. Noah squinted. Are you sure you know what you're doing? Liam flipped a pancake slightly too aggressively. It landed, somewhat, in the pan. He glanced at Noah. Absolutely. Noah was not convinced. Elena leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the edges of her lips. Liam Carter, one of the most feared businessmen in the world, was struggling with pancakes. It was the most ridiculous, heartwarming thing she had ever seen. But she wasn't ready to say that out loud. Not yet. It started small. Little things, fixing a broken toy, reading a bedtime story, driving Noah to school, things he had never imagined himself doing. Yet, somehow, these small moments felt bigger than any billion-dollar deal he had ever closed. At first, Noah kept his guard up, but day by day, inch by inch, he let Liam in. A tug on his sleeve, a request to push him on the swings, a quiet, "Can you help me with this?" And then one night, a moment that shook Liam to his core. Noah sat on the couch, fighting sleep, his little head nodding. Liam reached over, carefully adjusting a blanket over him. Noah's tiny fingers curled around his wrist, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he mumbled, "Good night, Dad." Liam's breath hitched, his entire world stilled. For a moment he thought he had imagined it. But no, Noah had said it. He didn't push it, didn't speak. He simply sat there, silent and shaken, as his son, fell asleep beside him. If Noah was beginning to let him in, Elena was still a fortress. She watched from the background, never fully stepping forward, never fully stepping away. She saw him try, saw him struggle, saw him change. But she also remembered the nights she spent alone, pregnant and terrified. The mornings she woke up knowing Liam had no idea their son even existed. The years she spent building a life without him. Could she trust him? Would he stay? One evening, Liam found her outside, sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. Without a word, he sat beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she asked the one thing she had been afraid to say. "Are you going to leave?" Liam turned his head, his blue eyes intense, unwavering. No, a single word, firm, certain. But was certainty enough? Elena wasn't sure, not yet. One night there was a storm. Thunder rolled through the sky, shaking the windows. Noah hated storms. Liam found him curled up under his blanket, hands over his ears. Without hesitation, he climbed into bed beside him. "It's just noise," Liam murmured. "You're safe." Noah hesitated. Then, slowly, he scooted closer. And just like that, Liam wasn't a stranger anymore. Elena stood in the doorway, watching. And for the first time, she felt something crack inside her. Something she had spent years locking away. Because Liam wasn't just trying. He was staying. The storm outside had died down, but inside the house, another battle raged. Noah lay in his bed, his small body burning with fever. His skin was pale, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Liam sat on the edge of the bed, jaw clenched, hands trembling. The thermometer read 104 degrees Fahrenheit, too high. Way too high. He had never felt this kind of fear before, not when making billion-dollar decisions, not when standing against ruthless business rivals. This fear was different. This fear was raw, uncontrollable, because this wasn't a business deal. This was his son, his little boy, suffering. And there was nothing Liam could do but hold on. Liam pressed a damp cloth to Noah's forehead, his heart pounding with every whimper Noah let out. "Elena," his voice was hoarse, barely controlled, "are you sure we shouldn't take him to the hospital?" Elena knelt beside the bed, exhaustion evident in her face. "The doctor said we should wait a little longer," she murmured, brushing Noah's damp curls from his forehead. "If his fever doesn't go down soon, we'll go." Liam hated waiting, hated feeling powerless, but he didn't leave, not once. He stayed. When Noah whimpered, Liam was there. When he shifted in his sleep, Liam adjusted the blankets. When the fever spiked, Liam whispered, "I'm here, buddy. I've got you." And somehow, despite the fear, despite everything, Noah reached for him. His tiny fingers curled around Liam's wrist, his grip weak but firm. And Liam didn't move, didn't breathe. Because at that moment, his son had chosen him. Not out of obligation, not out of expectation, but because Noah felt safe with him. And Liam Carter, the man who had never been anyone's safe place, realized he wanted nothing more than to be that for his son. Hours passed. Liam lost count of how many times he checked the thermometer, how many times he held his breath, waiting. Then, just as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Noah's fever finally broke, his breathing steadied, his skin cooled. Elena exhaled, pressing a shaking hand to her forehead. Liam let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Noah was okay. For the first time all night, relief washed over him. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, She was exhausted, her hair a tangled mess, her eyes filled with so much emotion it nearly stole his breath. And in that moment, something inside him cracked open. For the first time in his life, Liam Carter wasn't afraid of love. He wasn't afraid of needing someone. Because he already did. Without thinking, without hesitation, he spoke the words he had never said before. Words that had lived in his chest for too long. I love you, Elena. Elena's head snapped up, her breath hitched. But Liam wasn't finished. His voice softened, but his eyes burned with something undeniable. And I love our son. Elena had spent years convincing herself that she no longer waited for Liam, that she had buried her feelings, locked them away where they could never hurt her again. But now, here he was. Not the cold, distant man she had once known. Not the businessman who kept his heart hidden behind boardroom deals and carefully calculated words. This Liam was different. This Liam had spent the night fighting for their son, had whispered reassurances, had been there through every moment of fear. And now, he was giving her the one thing she had once thought impossible. His heart. Elena swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had imagined him saying those words, but hearing them now, hearing them when she wasn't sure if she could let herself believe, that was something else entirely. Liam, she whispered, her voice breaking, but he didn't let her pull away, didn't let her hide. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. I don't expect you to believe me right away, he said, his voice steady, but filled with quiet urgency. But I mean it. I love you. I love our son. And I'm not going anywhere. Elena's heart trembled. Her walls, the ones she had built so carefully, so painstakingly, began to crack. Because deep down, in a place she had tried to bury, she had always been waiting for him to say it, waiting for him to prove it, waiting for Liam Carter to finally choose love over fear. And now he had. The Amalfi Coast stretched endlessly before them, waves lapping against jagged cliffs, the sky painted in hues of gold and soft pink as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Elena stood at the edge of a private terrace, overlooking the sea, her breath catching at the beauty of it all. She turned, her dress flowing in the evening breeze, and there he was, Liam Carter. The man she had once loved, the man she had once feared she could never trust again. But now he was the man who had fought for her, the man who had stayed. And tonight, she had no idea that her world was about to change. Again. Liam reached into his pocket, his fingers grazing against the small velvet box he had carried with him all day. He had planned everything, the location, the words, the timing. But now that he was standing in front of her, his heart pounded in a way it never had before. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then took one step forward. Elena. Her name left his lips like a quiet promise, like a vow before it was spoken. She tilted her head, smiling softly. You're acting strange. Liam let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. No, I need to do this right. Then, before she could say another word, he dropped to one knee. The world stilled. The sound of waves, the distant laughter of tourists, the rustling of olive trees in the evening breeze, all of it faded. It was just the two of them. Elena's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Liam held the ring between them, but his gaze never left hers. And in that moment, he spoke the words he had waited so long to say. This time I'm not proposing out of duty. His voice was steady, but filled with emotion. I'm proposing because I love you, because I love our son, because I want forever, With both of you." Elena's breath hitched, tears welled in her eyes, her vision blurring, her heart pounding against her ribs. For years she had imagined this moment, but she had never imagined it would feel like this. Real, unshakable, true. She lowered her hands, her lips parting as a choked laugh escaped. Then she nodded. A single, trembling yes. And in the very next second, Liam slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms. Elena laughed into his chest, tears soaking into his shirt as he buried his face in her hair, holding her like she was the most precious thing in his world. Because she was. They were married 2 months later. A breathtaking seaside ceremony where the scent of salt and blooming jasmine filled the air, where the sound of the waves became their music, where the sun dipped into the ocean as if giving them its blessing. Elena walked down the aisle barefoot, her dress billowing in the wind, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Liam stood at the altar, waiting for her for forever. And in the background, Noah ran through the sand, laughing, tossing petals into the air like confetti, his joy as boundless as the ocean itself. It was perfect, not because it was extravagant, not because of the setting, but because it was real. Because this time there were no doubts, no running, no fear, just love. And as Liam kissed his bride beneath the endless sky, he finally understood. Love wasn't a cage. It wasn't something to fear. It was the most precious thing in life, and he would never let it go again.